The year is 1602. Imagine, if you will, a fleet of heavy wooden ships, their sails fat with the North Sea wind. These are the vessels of the newly formed Dutch East India Company, the VOC. But honestly, they are not merely merchant ships. They are floating fortresses, bristling with cannons and filled with men whose eyes are fixed on the distant eastern horizon. They are sailing away from the familiar gray skies of Holland, plunging into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Atlantic. Their mission is a gamble of incredible proportions, a roll of the dice with the lives of every man on board. The stakes are higher than any monarch's treasure control over the world's most valuable commodities. The journey itself is a brutal test of endurance. For months on end, the sailors see nothing but the endless rise and fall of the ocean. The air below deck is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale water, and the ever-present fear of disease. Scurvy blackens their gums and loosens their teeth. Storms rise from nowhere, monstrous waves crashing over the decks, threatening to splinter the sturdy oak hulls. Men are swept overboard, their cries swallowed by the roaring tempest. This is a world of hard-tack biscuits, salted meat crawling with maggots, and the constant grinding work of keeping the ship afloat and on course. It is, well, a crucible that forges hardened, desperate men. Yet, for all the misery, a feverish dream keeps them going. It is the dream of spice. They whisper tales of islands where nutmeg and cloves grow as common as weeds, where the air is thick with the scent of cinnamon. These are not just flavorings. They are the gold of the 17th century. The men on these ships, from the captain on his quarterdeck to the lowest cabin boy, are all chasing this fragrant fortune. They are willing to endure hell, and to inflict it on others, to reach the fabled Spice Islands. They are the pioneers of a new kind of empire, one not ruled by a king, but by a board of directors. As they round the Cape of Good Hope and steer into the Indian Ocean, the nature of their mission sharpens. This is no peaceful trading voyage. They are sailing into hostile waters, ready to confront their sworn enemies, the Portuguese, who have long dominated these trade routes. They are prepared to fight, to kill, and to conquer. Every creak of the ship's timbers, every snap of the canvas in the wind, is a reminder of the violence that underpins their quest. They are not just merchants. They are soldiers of commerce, the advance guard of a corporate machine that will soon change the world forever, staining it with both unimaginable wealth and untold blood. To understand the madness that drove men across the globe, one must first understand Europe's obsession with spice. In the 17th century, spices were not just a luxury. They were a symbol of immense wealth, power, and even good health. A handful of peppercorns could be worth more than a common laborer's yearly wage. A sack of nutmeg could buy a fine house in Amsterdam. These fragrant powders and dried buds, arriving from a mysterious and distant Orient, held a mystical allure. They were the ultimate status symbol, sprinkled lavishly on the food of kings, nobles, and the rising merchant class to show off their worldly success. The desire was fueled by more than just taste. Spices were central to the medicine of the day. Physicians believed that cloves could cure toothaches, that cinnamon could treat coughs, and that nutmeg possessed miraculous properties capable of warding off the plague. In an age when disease could wipe out entire cities, these beliefs gave spices a value far beyond their culinary use. They were seen as a defense against death itself. The rich carried small silver pomanders filled with spices, holding them to their noses in crowded streets, believing the potent aroma could purify the foul air and protect them from unseen pestilence. This desperation made the demand almost limitless. Before the Dutch entered the game, the spice trade was a long and perilous chain. Spices were grown on a few small islands in what is now Indonesia. From there, they were transported by local traders to hubs like Malacca, then carried by Arab dhows across the Indian Ocean. Venetian and Genoese merchants would then buy them in the ports of Alexandria or Constantinople, finally bringing them overland into Europe. At each stage of this journey, the price was marked up astronomically. By the time a single clove reached a market in London or Paris, its cost had multiplied 1,000 times over. It was this incredible profit margin that caught the attention of the ambitious Dutch. The Dutch saw an opportunity. Why allow the Portuguese, the Venetians, and the Arabs to control this golden river? Why not sail directly to the source? By cutting out the middlemen, they could seize the entire profit for themselves. It was a simple, brutal, and brilliant idea. The goal was not just to participate in the trade, but to monopolize it entirely. They did not want a piece of the pie. They wanted the whole pie, the recipe, and the oven it was baked in. This single-minded pursuit of total control over the spice supply chain would become the founding principle of the VOC and the justification for all the actions that followed. By the end of the 16th century, the Netherlands was buzzing with commercial energy. Individual Dutch expeditions had already made the treacherous voyage to Asia, returning with holds full of spice and heads full of plans. These early voyages were chaotic and competitive. Different companies from different Dutch cities sent their own fleets, driving up the purchase price of spices in Asia by bidding against each other, and then crashing the selling price in Europe by flooding the market all at once. It was a cutthroat, disorganized, and ultimately self-defeating scramble for riches. The fierce internal competition was threatening to ruin the very trade they sought to dominate. The Dutch government, a council of pragmatic and business-minded men known as the States General, watched this chaos with growing alarm. They saw the immense potential of the spice trade not just for individual merchants, but for the nation as a whole. The Netherlands was in the midst of a long, bloody war for independence from Spain, and the spice trade could fund this fight. They needed a single, unified entity that could stand against their Portuguese and Spanish rivals and maximize profits for the Dutch Republic. The solution was radical and unprecedented. Force all the competing companies to merge into one single, gigantic enterprise. On March 20th, 1602, the States General made it law. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or the United East India Company, VOC, was born. It was a fusion of all the smaller trading ventures into one national behemoth. This was not just a merger. It was the creation of the world's first multinational corporation. The company was given a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. No other Dutch citizen or company was legally allowed to trade in this vast swath of the globe. It was a government-sanctioned monopoly of breathtaking scale. The structure of the VOC was as innovative as its concept. It was governed by a board of 17 directors, the Heren 16, or the Lords 17, who were chosen from the ranks of the most powerful merchants in the Netherlands. Crucially, the company was also the world's first to issue public stock. This allowed ordinary Dutch citizens, from wealthy artisans to modest shopkeepers, to buy a share in the company's future profits. This spread the immense financial risk of the voyages and gave a huge portion of the population a direct personal stake in the company's success. It turned the quest for Asian spices from a private adventure into a national obsession. The charter granted to the VOC in 1602 was more than a simple business license. It was a document that blurred the line between a commercial company and a sovereign state. The States General, focused on their war with Spain, effectively outsourced the expansion of Dutch power in Asia to the VOC. They gave the company powers that were normally reserved for kings and governments alone. The Heren 13, a group of unelected merchants sitting in a boardroom in Amsterdam, were granted the authority to wield the full might of a nation on the other side of the world, far from any government oversight. The VOC was given the right to build forts and establish colonies on foreign soil. It could sign treaties with local rulers, acting as if it were a sovereign nation itself. If diplomacy failed, the charter empowered the company to wage war. The VOC could raise its own private army and build its own navy. Its ships were not just cargo vessels, they were warships, and its employees were not just traders, they were soldiers and administrators of a budding empire. The company could arrest people, try them in its own courts, and execute them. It was a state within a state, a corporate entity with the power of life and death over millions. This fusion of commercial and military power was the VOC's secret weapon. Unlike its competitors, who often had to wait for support from their national navies, the VOC had its own integrated military force. A VOC admiral could make the decision to attack a rival port or coerce a local sultan into a one-sided trade deal on the spot, without needing to send a message back to Amsterdam and wait months for a reply. This gave the company incredible speed, flexibility, and a fearsome capacity for violence. Its primary goal was always profit, but it could use the tools of warfare to achieve it. The implications of this were honestly terrifying. The company's leaders, Men like the Governor-General in Asia were not accountable to the people they ruled, nor were they truly accountable to their own government back home. Their only masters were the Heeren 16, and their only mandate was to deliver profit to the shareholders. This created a system where brutality was not just tolerated, it was encouraged as long as it secured the monopoly and increased the dividends. The VOC became a machine programmed for profit, and it was given the legal right to crush anything or anyone that stood in its way. It was an experiment in corporate power that would have devastating consequences. Armed with its extraordinary charter, the VOC did not waste time with gentle persuasion. Its goal was a total monopoly, and it pursued this with ruthless efficiency. The primary target was a tiny cluster of islands in the Banda Sea, in what is now Indonesia. These were the only places on Earth where nutmeg and mace grew. For centuries, the Bandanese people had traded freely with Javanese, Arab, and Chinese merchants. They did not understand the European concept of a monopoly. They saw no reason to sell their precious spices to the Dutch alone, especially when English traders offered them better prices for their goods. The Dutch response was swift and brutal. They saw the Bandanese desire for free trade not as a negotiation tactic, but as an act of rebellion. In 1609, a Dutch fleet arrived under the command of Admiral Peter Willems, Verhoef. He demanded the Bandanese sign a treaty granting the VOC an exclusive monopoly. When the island elders resisted, Verhoef and several of his senior officers were lured into a meeting and ambushed, killed by the locals who were fed up with Dutch arrogance. For the VOC, this was not just a tragedy, it was a justification for war. It was the excuse they needed to unleash their full military power. Over the next decade, the VOC systematically conquered the islands. They built massive stone forts, like Fort Nassau on the main island of Nera. Their cannons pointing not just out to sea to ward off rivals, but inward, towards the local villages. This was a clear message: obey or be destroyed. The Dutch imposed their will through force of arms. They attacked any English ships that dared to approach the islands, and they punished any Bandanese caught trading with them. The paradise of the Spice Islands was transformed into a military garrison, an open-air prison where the entire population was forced to work for a single corporate master. The struggle was not just against the Bandanese. The VOC was locked in a fierce, undeclared war with its main European rival, the English East India Company. On the tiny island of Roon, a place barely 5 kilometers long, the English had established a small trading post. The Bandanese on run, desperate for an ally against the Dutch, pledged their allegiance to the English crown. For years, the VOC besieged the island, determined to drive the English out and complete their nutmeg monopoly. This small, remote island became a focal point of global conflict, a symbol of the vicious corporate rivalry that defined the age. The VOC's campaign of violence reached its horrific climax under the leadership of one man, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. Cohen was the ultimate company man. Ambitious, intelligent, and utterly devoid of pity, he was appointed Governor-General of the VOC's Asian territories in 1618. He believed that trade could not exist without war, and war could not exist without trade. For Cohen, the continued resistance of the Bandanese people was an intolerable obstacle to profit. He wrote to the Heeren 17 in Amsterdam, demanding a final solution. He argued that to secure the monopoly, the native population had to be completely removed and replaced. In 1621, Cohen personally led a massive punitive expedition to the Banda Islands. He arrived with a fleet of 13 ships and nearly 2,000 soldiers, a force of overwhelming power. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic slaughter. Cohen's soldiers swept across the islands, burning villages, destroying crops, and killing anyone who resisted. The Bandanese were hunted down in the hills and forests. Those who were not killed outright were captured. The island's leaders were publicly and brutally executed. 44 village elders were beheaded, their bodies dismembered and displayed as a warning to all. The scale of the depopulation was staggering. Before Cohen's arrival, the Banda Islands were home to an estimated 15,000 people. Within a few months, fewer than 1,000 remained, hiding in the mountains or having fled to other islands. The VOC had effectively wiped an entire society from the face of the earth. The once vibrant islands fell silent, their villages empty and their fields untended. This genocide, for it can be called nothing less, was committed not in the name of a king or a god, but in the name of corporate profit. It was a cold, calculated act of extermination designed to secure control over the nutmeg trade. With the native population gone, Cohen implemented the final stage of his plan. He divided the land into plantations, called perken, and leased them to retired Dutch soldiers and VOC employees, known as perkeneers. These new colonists were supplied with enslaved laborers, captured from other parts of Asia, to work the nutmeg groves. The VOC now had its perfect monopoly. They controlled the land, the labor, and every single nutmeg that was harvested. The price of the spice in Amsterdam soared, and the dividends paid to shareholders reached spectacular new heights. The butcher of Banda had delivered on his promise. While the Banda Islands were being drenched in blood, the city of Amsterdam was entering its golden age. The profits flowing back from Asia transformed the city into the wealthiest and most dynamic metropolis in the world. The headquarters of the VOC, the Oost-Indisch Huis, was the nerve center of this global enterprise. Within its walls, the Heren 17 counted their profits, planned new voyages, and made decisions that held the power of life and death for people thousands of miles away. The wealth generated by the company financed the magnificent canals, the stately merchant houses, and the flourishing culture of the Dutch Republic. Walk through the streets of 17th century Amsterdam, and you would see the fruits of the VOC's monopoly everywhere. The warehouses lining the waterfront bulged with spices, silks, and porcelain from the east. The city's stock exchange, the first of its kind, was a frenzied hub, where shares in the VOC were traded for incredible sums. Merchants, once of modest means, built opulent homes decorated with fine art and filled with exotic curiosities. The Dutch Republic became a beacon of prosperity, art, and science, with painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer capturing the confident, bourgeois life of its citizens. But this glittering prosperity had a dark and hidden foundation. The gold that lined the pockets of Amsterdam's merchants was mined from the suffering of others. The beautiful canal houses were, in a very real sense, built on the bones of the Bandanese. The dividends that made shareholders rich were paid for with the labor of enslaved people toiling on plantations in Asia. The connection between the serene, orderly world of Amsterdam and the violent, chaotic world of the VOC's colonies was direct and undeniable. Yet it was a connection that most were happy to ignore. The spices on their tables left no taste of the blood that was shed to acquire them. This stark contrast reveals the moral geography of the VOC's empire. It was a system designed to concentrate wealth in one place by extracting it brutally from another. The company created a firewall between cause and effect. The shareholders in Holland saw only the rising value of their stock and the impressive annual dividends. They were insulated from the horrific violence that made those profits possible. The VOC's genius was not just in its business model, but in its ability to separate the beneficiaries of its empire from the victims, allowing one to flourish in blissful ignorance of the other's agony. For nearly 2 centuries, the VOC was an unstoppable force. It was the richest company the world had ever seen, a global empire of trade and terror. At its peak in the mid-17th century, it operated nearly 5,000 ships, employed tens of thousands of people, and maintained a private army of 10,000 soldiers. It had driven the Portuguese from the Spice Islands, established a key colony at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and held trading posts from Persia to Japan. It seemed as though its power was absolute and its profits would flow forever. But even the most powerful empires carry the seeds of their own destruction. The very thing that made the VOC so powerful, its massive size and military might, eventually became a crippling weakness. Maintaining a global network of forts, garrisons, and warships was incredibly expensive. The costs of administration and defense began to eat away at the profits from trade. The company became bloated and bureaucratic. Corruption became rampant, with employees at every level engaging in private illegal trade to enrich themselves at the company's expense. The VOC's own servants were undermining the monopoly that their predecessors had killed to create. Furthermore, the world was changing. The VOC's brutal monopoly on a few specific spices became less important as global tastes shifted. Tea, coffee, and textiles became the new engines of colonial trade. And here, the VOC faced stiff competition, particularly from the rapidly rising English East India Company. The Dutch had focused so intensely on controlling the small world of the Spice Islands that they were slow to adapt to the new, larger global market. Their obsession with monopoly had made them rigid and uncreative, while their rivals were more flexible and opportunistic. The final blow came in the late 18th century. A series of costly wars with England shattered the VOC's naval power. The company, already drowning in debt and corruption, could no longer defend its trade routes or its colonies. In 1796, during the political turmoil of the Napoleonic Wars, the Dutch government, now the Batavian Republic, nationalized the company. On December 31, 1799, the charter of the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie expired and was not renewed. The greatest corporation in history, the company that had acted like a state, was dissolved. Its territories became the formal colonies of the Dutch nation, but its revolutionary and violent legacy was complete. The story of the VOC is more than a fascinating, dark chapter of history. It is a cautionary tale that echoes powerfully in our own time. The VOC was the prototype, the first terrifying experiment in what can happen when a commercial enterprise is granted too much power and is freed from moral and governmental restraint. It showed the world that a company, driven solely by the relentless pursuit of profit for its shareholders, could be capable of acting with the ruthlessness of the most tyrannical state, committing acts of war, conquest, and even genocide. Today, we live in a world dominated by multinational corporations whose wealth and influence dwarf that of many nations. These modern giants may not have their own formal armies or the right to wage war, but they wield immense power. They can influence governments through lobbying, shape public opinion through massive marketing campaigns, and move vast sums of capital across the globe in an instant, destabilizing economies. They operate in a complex international system where they can often avoid taxes, regulations, and accountability for their actions, particularly for labor abuses or environmental damage in developing countries. The core dilemma raised by the VOC remains with us. Where do we draw the line between a company's right to pursue profit and its responsibility to society and humanity? The VOC's directors in Amsterdam were able to rationalize their company's brutality because it was distant and it delivered immense wealth. Today, complex global supply chains can similarly obscure the connection between the products we consume and the conditions under which they are made. The suffering of a worker in a faraway factory is as invisible to a modern consumer as the suffering of a Bandonese farmer was to a VOC shareholder. The ghost of the VOC forces us to ask critical questions. What happens when a company becomes more powerful than the governments that are supposed to regulate it? What is our collective responsibility for the actions of the corporations we empower with our investments and our purchases? The story of the Dutch East India Company is a stark reminder that the pursuit of profit, when divorced from human values, can lead down a very dark path. It stands as a permanent warning from history. A company should never be allowed to become a country.